Good evening and welcome to the first edition of Late Night Lineup since 1972. It's good to be back after 36 years. Tonight we're coming from the BBC's Westminster studio, home to programmes like The Daily Politics and This Week, which is strangely fitting because back in the late 60s, when the programme came from Television Centre, we were often found squeezing ourselves into borrowed space in a weather studio. Well, the space is still borrowed, but now we have a little bit more of it. Tonight, this channel has been broadcasting the Permissive Night, looking back at a time when Britain was beginning to embrace more progressive ideas and enshrine them in legislation. Tonight on Line-Up, we'll be looking back to the late 1960s at the supposedly permissive and socially dynamic period. Joining me this evening is a distinguished cast of guests. Peter Hitchens is a regular columnist for the Mail on Sunday, a polemicist and author of The Abolition of Britain and A Brief History of Crime, both works highly critical of changes in British society since the 1960s. Robert Winston is a distinguished scientist, fertility expert and broadcaster of such series as The Human Body and Child of Our Time. He's also a Labour peer. The novelist Margaret Drabble is a biographer as well and a critic whose work often examines the relationship between individuals and contemporary society. And Michael Howard, QC, an MP since 1983, Home Secretary under John Major and sometime leader of the Conservative Party. He and his wife Sandra recently enlightened the nation about his nocturnal habits as a contestant of All-Star Mr. and Mrs. Welcome, all of you, to the programme. The first thing I want to know is where you all were and what you were doing, and indeed what take you had on the 60s. Peter.
Well, I was growing up. I was
schoolboy.
Partly, not for long though. I came to a mutual disagreement with my school. I was getting arrested for various different things, and I was generally preparing for a life as a troublemaker, which I think I have tried to continue.
So you were expelled from school?
No, I wasn't expelled exactly. I would call it a mutual disagreement, but I left school at 15. So,
lawbreaker already.
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
Robert Winston.
When I was a medical student, I suppose rather late coming to my first sexual experiences, and qualifying in medicine in 64, and then being completely disenchanted with the authoritarian attitude in medicine and giving it up and going into the theatre. So in that sense, I suppose the 60s did have an impact on me.
And you liked what was happening?
Well, I came to my senses eventually and went back to medicine and then went into science, really. So.
Margaret Drabble.
I was writing books and having babies and trying to do too many things at once.
And not many things have changed for writers, I don't think.
Life is much the same, but the babies do grow up.
And what take did you have on the 60s?
I enjoyed them enormously. I thought it was a very exciting and liberating time. It was a good time to be young, and even though I felt frustrated at not being able to enjoy everything that was on offer as I pushed the double pushchair up the hill, I nevertheless was happy that it was happening, and I enjoyed recording it. I enjoyed writing about the changes I saw.
When you go back and read now what you wrote in the 60s, what do you make of that?
Well, I'm astonished by some of the attitudes we had to very simple things like smoking and drinking. It's amazing how profoundly some of our attitudes have changed that we never thought would change at all.
Michael Howard, you were a lawyer already?
I was starting off at the bar as a barrister, and I fought my first general election in 1966 in Liverpool as a stripling of 24.
As a Tory in Liverpool, not much hope of winning.
I don't think it was a great surprise when I didn't win.
And how did the 60s affect you?
I enjoyed them. I think the thing I enjoyed most was the music. I mean, the Beatles and the Stones, and I mean, there was a real revolution in popular music, and that was terrific. And I think that's probably the thing I remember most.
Were you, all of you, aware as the 60s progressed that something important was underway? Did you have a sense of change? Margaret, you feel...
Yes, certainly. Women's lives were changing quite rapidly. There was a sort of a critical mass of people like me and you who were insisting on having careers, even though it was so difficult to do it all at once. But there was a feeling of progress and of moving into the workplace and of having one's voice heard, which was very exciting. I look at clips of me now on film sometimes, and I look terribly angry, which I wasn't at all. But it was the thing to be, was to look angry and stand up for your rights. So I remember that feeling of things changing. My mother's generation was so passive, and they were angry, but in a bottled-up, cruel kind of way, and we were angry in a more extrovert way.
Michael, you mentioned the music, and of course it's the tradition to speak of the 60s as rock and roll and hippies and hanging out and that kind of social behaviour. Were you aware of important legal changes going forward? Were you as a lawyer?
Well, I suppose I was getting involved in politics, so I was interested in what was happening in Parliament.
What did the Tories stand for in those days?
Well, I'm not sure I can give you chapter and verse on the position in respect of each of these particular things. Homosexuality, for instance, which is one of the things I think we're going to talk about, had happened in the previous decade. The legalisation of that's right, the Wolfenden Report, and I think it was the 1957 Act. Capital punishment was outlawed in 1965, and I do remember that at the time I was certainly opposed to that. I changed my mind subsequently, but at the time I was opposed to the abolition of capital punishment. The other change, I don't think I felt very strongly about divorce reform, which was the other big change. So I don't think there was a sort of across-the-board party view necessarily, but perhaps my memory is playing me false.
What about, you've written about the era, Peter, do you think there was a groundswell of demand for change? We want the laws different?
There was an extraordinary, as like the shiver that goes through the landscape in the spring, there was an extraordinary feeling that something was changing, and I bought the lot. I thought it was all absolutely wonderful. And the only thing which disturbed me at the time, and which made me reflect later on, was this extraordinary feeling I had that all authority had gone. That if you pushed hard enough at anybody, they'd give in. And actually, when you're young, that has two different effects. One, you realise you can do absolutely everything. And the other thing is you realise so can everybody else. And it was that worked on me. But no, I bought the whole thing. I have an impeccable liberal record from the 1960s of supporting absolutely every crackpot idea that there was, and some that were good. And it was quite clear and obvious to any conscious person at the time that a revolution of some kind was taking place.
Robert, you spoke about the authoritarian nature of medicine. Was it hierarchical? Was it?
So it was very hierarchical, and it was taught in a hierarchical fashion. But I think I rather disagree with my colleagues here, because I don't really see the 60s as an entity. I think that the 60s was part of a natural progression after the 40s and 50s, and that in fact after the war there was a sudden burgeoning that happened in Britain, which I remember as a child starting round about the time of the Festival of Britain in 1951, and the sudden huge amount of artistic activity. Suddenly the theatre was happening. I remember going to the Aldwych on almost a daily basis when I could afford it, to concerts and so on, which was well before the 60s. And perhaps medically, maybe what stands out in the 60s clearly is the Abortion Act of 67. And I do remember being absolutely passionate about reform of the abolition of capital punishment and speaking in debates as a student. But I don't know whether that was a product of the 60s. I think it's much more of the fact that really there was a kind of authoritarian attitude towards capital punishment, which we really needed to change because it seemed to be so unfair.
Well, we're going to pick off some of these subjects one by one, because tonight there have been different programmes on this channel illustrating each of these changes. And the first one we're going to consider is the change in the law about homosexuality. Here's an extract from that programme.
Do you have any regrets about the last 25 years?
Well, no. I wish I had been born now, because public opinion is different, and I would have read more and I would have known more, and I wouldn't have started out quite so backward and frightened, shy, not knowing anything when I started out. Life before you meet someone is hell. You never met anyone else. It is really hell for a person. And you get that you feel you want to jump off a bridge. You don't know what to do. You walk the streets and you don't know a single person to talk to. Nowadays, I imagine you could find out information somewhere or other, but you couldn't then, before the war. It was all hush-hush. So I wish I'd been born a few years later, and my teen years wouldn't have been quite so difficult.
What a lot of sadness there was, and also complete ignorance. I mean, it's so poignant, that, isn't it?
Yes, although I went to a day public school where, in fact, homosexuality wasn't that uncommon and wasn't really regarded very aberrant either. I remember it being widely recognised. I remember some of my friends even being allowing themselves to be picked up in taxis by male homosexuals in London in the 50s. And we used to boast that we presented King's College, Cambridge, with more homosexuals than any other member of the college.
Did the teachers take a view of this?
I don't know. I don't think they did terribly. I mean, I think being a day school, its sexuality was quite up front, actually. Now, maybe it's a different kind of sexuality in a boarding school. It's more of a hothouse. But the fact that we were able to make contacts in London with people fairly freely at a time when we weren't being very closely regarded by our parents, it was already, what I'm really saying is I think the liberation started before the 60s, actually.
Was this after the Act, Robert?
No, this is before the Act. I mean, I left school in 58, 59.
And the Act was 57.
No, it was 67.
Was it?
The Act was 67. Wolfenden was 57.
The report was 57.
The report, but it took them 10 years to implement
Indeed,
Wolfenden,
right.
which is and it was illegal. I mean, the activities you're describing were illegal.
We used to joke about it being illegal, too.
Yeah.
In fact, sometimes I remember one of my friends boasting how he'd got into a taxi with somebody and then actually at a traffic light slipped out the other side when it suited him.
But these were, they were taken quite lightly, but they were known to be subversive activities. I mean, obviously homosexuality wasn't invented in either 57 or 67. And when I was at Cambridge, it was quite renowned who the homosexuals were, and both among the dons and among the students. So what a strange relationship we had to the law, Michael, if we could all accept that breaking the law was run-of-the-mill.
Yes, and that was one of the many arguments for changing the law and for legalising it.
We can hardly have imagined that it would be as it is today. Has it been totally improvement? Has it all been smooth sailing?
What happened in 1967 was an act of kindness and tolerance and the abolition of a law that should never have existed in the first place. But that was the problem. Once you had abolished a law, you opened up a whole different subject. You moved from the question of decent tolerance, which is what the Leo Absey Act was about in 1967, and I think anybody can recognise that, onto the next question of equality. And the campaign which had brought about the Absey Bill in 1967 continued. And I think that what quite a lot of people now find disturbing is that rather than settling for tolerance, the homosexual political movement has decided that what it wants instead is to change the whole culture, the whole moral culture of the country. Frankly, I think it's a very minor part of political and social life, but it's become a very important poster boy for sexual revolutionaries who want to change and undermine the institution of marriage, particularly.
Good thing, bad thing?
Well, to the extent of 1967, undoubtedly a good thing. Some of the things which have followed from it, I think, increasingly bad. Not to do with homosexuality so much as to do with the general sexual revolution and the idea that the unique privileges of marriage should be taken away from it and just distributed to anybody.
Civil marriages?
Civil partnerships. Well, I'm against them. I think that not because I want to make life difficult for homosexuals, but because I think heterosexual marriage itself is a unique relationship. If it's not privileged uniquely, it'll die. Is dying, in fact.
I went to a civil partnership the other day, and it was one of the most delightful and happy occasions. It had no effect or connection with heterosexual events at all. It was just two people having an agreement with their families to support them, not frightened like that young man we saw, and making an arrangement about their futures. It had nothing to do with whether I am legally married or not.
There's a point between those two things. It actually does, because if the point about marriage is that it's privileged, And it's privilege largely because it's a difficult relationship to sustain.
But
if a privilege is given to everybody, it ceases to be a privilege.
And so it should.
But
So
Peter,
it should.
I can't help feeling...
That's a disagreement.
I can't help feeling, Peter, that there's still a tinge of homophobia in some of our discussions today, which is interesting. For example, in the recent discussions over lesbian women having IVF without the need for a father, certainly in the House of Lords, one occasionally felt that there was a homophobic tendency in some of that debate. It's still there. There's still a slight edge. Obviously, it's receding, but I'm not sure we've got rid of it completely in our society.
I voted earlier this week in favour of the amendment which emphasised the importance of the role of the father. I didn't do it for any reasons of homophobia, but because I do think that fathers are important role models. And I think one of the changes which has been less beneficial for society has been a diminution in the role of the family. I don't actually think that that's got very much to do with any of the legislative changes which took place in the 60s. I think it's connected with other things, but I think it's been harmful to society. And I think where, and there are very, very few occasions, but where legislators have an opportunity to emphasise the role of the father, they should do so.
Well, let's leave the discussion about the situation today until later in the programme, because I want to ask you, did you have personal experience whose lives, of friends, acquaintances whose lives were changed by that act? Were you aware of it making a difference in the lives of people you knew?
People were able to tell the truth. I mean, books were written which told true lives about homosexuals. There'd been an amazing gloss, and not to say lying and cover-up about people in the past. And suddenly you were allowed to say that so-and-so was a homosexual. You could publish this stuff. And it was an end of lying. And it was an end of lying in private life and in public life. And before that, there'd been suicides. There continued to be suicides through cover-ups and blackmail. But to me, it seemed that the homosexual law reform made for honesty and clarity with a great number of very ordinary people.
They can hardly have imagined at the time that we would end up with things like the Gay Pride March and the flamboyance on the streets that you see.
Oddly enough, some of the crustiest of the opponents of the Outsea Bill did indeed suggest that things of that kind would result from it, and were, as the crusty old Bufton Tuftons always are, laughed at, and actually turned out to be better predictors of the results than most other people. But the thing which strikes me about the discussion we're having is two people have used it. They've pronounced it differently, and I don't blame them because it's such a stupid word. Homophobia. Something which people who might have been able to watch this programme through a lens of the future 40 years ago would find as bizarre as we find them using the Q word now. And I think there's something very peculiar about the use of this word describing what is in fact an opinion as a pathology, or trying to make an opinion into a pathology, deeply intolerant and very worrying, as intolerant in its way as the attitude towards homosexuals used to be. It seems to me swapping one intolerance for another is not a good deal. Get rid of all intolerance, fine, but move from one intolerance to another and you're not actually making progress, you're simply changing one bad thing for another.
Well, I think it's self-evident in the headlines this week, where paper after paper talks about gay couples and no need for the father, when the real issue, of course, is older single women who can't get pregnant and are facing sterility, where actually that's what the bill will do. It liberates these women and allows them to have pregnancy. But it's been completely sidetracked. It's almost not mentioned in the press. And that suggests there is a kind of homophobic reaction to the gay couple in this instance. That's what I mean by homophobia. It's an unreasonable and unhealthy accent on lesbianism.
OK, divorce next. There was a programme about divorce in which there was a debate about the change in that law. And here's an extract from the programme in which Baroness Summerskill is putting forward a woman's opposition to changing the divorce law.
I call this bill a Casanova's Charter because I believe that it is a bill for wealthy men. For what ordinary man in a factory or an office can keep two wives? Well then, if, as you say, the judge is not going to permit a divorce, this bill is going to be a bill for the wealthy only. And as a parliamentarian, I say that legislation which can only be used by the wealthy in the country is bad legislation.
Michael Howard, how do you respond to that?
Well, at least it demonstrates that the argument didn't divide on party lines, because Edith Summersgill was a Labour life peer and had before that been a Labour Member of Parliament for a long time, indeed I think a Labour Minister. Well, she was wrong, wasn't she?
Casanova's Charter, though?
She was wrong. It wasn't. It hasn't only been for the wealthy. It wasn't ever only going to be for the wealthy. And I think it is part of the creation of a more tolerant society.
How do you feel about her?
I thought she was splendid, and I could see her point referred accurately to a certain older generation. I mean, our generation have always had to fend for ourselves and expected to have to do so, but she was trying to speak for those who had had no profession and who weren't going to get their husbands' pensions and who would be left aside. And I thought she spoke well for them, but of course, as Michael said, she was absolutely wrong about what happened, because divorce became available for everybody, and no-fault divorce was a great move forward.
I think it's interesting that she makes the point, and indeed it applies, I think, in a sense, to some of the other laws that were changed, homosexuality being one of the issues, in that if you were rich, you lived in a different relationship to the problem than if you were poor. And the divorce laws certainly had been easier for the wealthy, hadn't they?
Well, I come from quite a special category because I come from an Orthodox Jewish family. And my mother and my grandmother were absolutely passionate about trying to get divorce modernised in Jewish law as well. And my mother travelled the world going to rabbis in Israel, for example, the chief rabbi in Israel, both the Sephardi and the Ashkenazi chief rabbi, to try and represent the cause of women, to try and make it a bit easier for them not to be chained to their husbands. And that, I think, was partly in response to this movement in Britain. I think that certainly informed both my mother and my grandmother. So I'm seeing it from a slightly odd angle. It's a privileged example, really. It's a special example.
Peter, how did you respond to her?
Well, it's a pity that she was wrong. It was nice that people were expressing doubts about it, but her particular doubts were the wrong ones. If she'd said this is going to be a disaster for millions of children who will find that they no longer have two parents and that their lives are hopelessly insecure and that they are abandoned to the chaos in children's lives which results in divorce, she would have had a much more prophetic point. It's also important to note that a lot of the opposition to these changes did come from within what was then the right wing of the Labour Party, a thing which has now completely ceased to exist. And it wasn't by any means on party lines. And worth remembering that. But had she said that, had people foreseen that, then I think there would have been a lot more consideration. What the 69 Act did was it gave the state the power to drag a husband or a wife out of the home in which they believed they belonged by force of law if they didn't wish to be so dragged. The provisions which allowed a marriage to break up simply because of irretrievable breakdown after 5 years meant that even if one of the spouses didn't want to go, they had to. And that's an amazing increase in the power of the state, and a disaster, as I say, for the children who were left with the strange family arrangements so many of them now have to cope with.
What is interesting, looking back, though, is how enormously seedy it was, in that if you had wanted a divorce before the law changed, you had to have evidence of adultery, which often involved detectives lurking in hotel cupboards to pounce out at the couple involved. And a part of that is also the secrecy that was involved throughout relationships. Everybody was ashamed and secret. I mean, there was always plenty of sex going on. I don't believe there was an era in which there wasn't. But again, rather like homosexuality, people were both shamed and secretive. And I think the opening up of society is rather interesting then. Don't you feel that? That we...
But it's not always for the best, and you can look back at many of the aspects of the 1950s and 1960s. People like me are always being told, oh, you think there was a golden age. I don't think any of the kind. There was no golden age. It was hell for a lot of people. The truth is it is now hell for a different set of people. And have we swapped one hell for another? And if so, can we call it progress? The question is what price you pay for the thing that you want. And for the liberation of adults who wanted to break up marriages, you've paid an enormous price in the lives of children.
But it is arguable, isn't it, that that growing up in a very unhappy household, in a very unhappy marriage, as a child of a very unhappy marriage, happily not an experience I've ever had, but it is arguable that is as bad for the child as the parents getting divorced. I'm not suggesting that there aren't many cases of very unhappy children whose lives have been blighted by the divorce of their parents. But there will also have been many children whose lives will have been blighted by growing up in an unhappy marriage with no prospect of escape.
But since 1969, a marriage doesn't have to be that unhappy for the law to be willing to break it up. It's amazing how quickly people resort to the divorce law.
But before 1969, there was no escape.
If you have a ship that may or may not be sinking that's surrounded by lifeboats, which are perhaps more perilous than the ship, they'll climb into the lifeboats. If it isn't surrounded by those lifeboats, they have to choose whether to save the ship or not. They may save the ship. The fact is, marriage, once it becomes easier to break up, will break up more easily. And it may be true. You say it's arguable. I think it's questionable that an angry marriage is worse than no marriage at all. But what is certainly the case is it's so easy now to opt for divorce. And children play so small a part in the decision of the courts and of the people involved that I don't think that really counts. Marriages which could get along quite happily, or would have done before this happened, now break up.
So I think the vast majority
or never take place at all.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think the vast majority of people do not take divorce lightly.
I agree.
I think it is not a step. It is not a step that people take lightly or casually. That doesn't dispose of all your arguments.
You can't conceivably maintain that they take it more less lightly now as a result of these laws being changed. You can't conceivably claim that divorce is harder now than it was.
Of course, and that's
not.
It has to be taken less lightly now than it was before.
Peter, you sound as though the law forces people to get divorced. They choose.
Exactly
no, not at all. They, as two adults, choose to get divorced. No. And the law does not intervene to divorce them. Something has broken down and they then divorce. And I entirely agree with Michael. So I'm surprised to agree so much with Michael that an unhappy couple can cause great pain and permanent psychological damage to children, and that has nothing to do with wedlock. It's to do with the unhappiness in the marriage. And I think that the sooner you get out of a situation like that, the better, and with the less pain that you escape with, the better. I agree with you that the consideration of the children is very important, but I don't think that married couples who stay married always put their children first. In fact, we know they don't.
All right, well, we're moving on to another major change in the 60s, which was the law on abortion. Earlier this evening, there was a programme about people who had had an abortion. A rather sensitive and poignant story was told, but we were also introduced to a professional abortionist, a woman who had gone to prison for committing an illegal activity. Here she is.
How many abortions did you do?
Oh, that's a question. I did quite a lot.
Roughly?
Oh, a few hundred, I dare say.
Now, if at some stage during the time you were doing abortions you'd wanted to stop, would it have been easy for you without leaving the district?
Well, no, not without leaving the district. Too many people knew.
And what kind of pressure did they put on you to do the abortion?
Well, no pressure, only they have the way of making you feel sorry for them.
Mm-hmm. Were you satisfied yourself that what you were doing to them was not dangerous?
No, I haven't any fear of that whatever. I have every confidence in myself. And I'm here now, and I could have carried on for the rest of my life and know that nothing would ever happen to anyone.
What makes you so sure of that? Because, of course, doctors...
Because I know what I'm doing.
Where did you learn? Have you any medical training?
I have no medical training whatever. It's just something that comes to me, and I could carry on forever. And nothing would ever happen to anyone.
That's an amazing...
astonishing clip. I'm very glad she didn't have to carry on forever. I mean, what an unfortunate position that would have been if a woman, I'm not saying anything against her as a human being, but a woman in her position with her lack of training had gone on doing hundreds of abortions. Terrible situation.
I remember holding with both hands the hands of a 17-year-old girl who was about 6 years younger than I was, as she died as a result of a Clostridium infection in her uterus following an illegal abortion. And what that remarkable Act of Parliament did was to stop that from happening. And her name was Mary. That was not an isolated incident in my experience as a doctor. And I must tell you that what was happening was that when I qualified, that was in '64, we were still actually telling untruths about women who were coming into hospital with unwanted pregnancies, who we would say were having a miscarriage, and we would scrape out the uterus on the grounds there was a miscarriage, sometimes finding blood from somewhere to stain clothing and that sort of thing.
Had they asked for an abortion? Had they come in?
They wanted to have their pregnancy terminated for all sorts of reasons.
And they turned up at the hospital to ask?
And so that was certainly happening, and in fact what was actually happening before '67 was a lie, just as there were other examples of this sort of legislation. And David Steele's Act of Parliament, which was finally adopted by the government, undoubtedly was a huge force for good, and it really did have a revolution. It did mean a revolution, even though I think that Act of Parliament may have been arguably misused since.
It's interesting to look back, because also in the programme, women talked about what they did when they thought they were pregnant. And I do remember times when people would drink gin, jump off tables, throw themselves downstairs. I mean, it was really an actual dire event in the lives of people I knew, wasn't it, to be pregnant and not to want to be?
It was quite terrifying, and we were so ignorant about what made you pregnant in the first place. I mean, the medical ignorance was quite astonishing, because we didn't know what made you pregnant, basically. I mean, it does seem strange now, but I do think that women, girls, thought heavy petting could get you pregnant. They didn't know at what point conception took place, and they didn't know if they were pregnant, if they missed a period. They then started drinking gin and, as you say, throwing themselves under a bus. It was a terrible era, because you couldn't honestly own up to what you were afraid of, because then you were in such bad area.
Why did it take so long to change this law?
I don't know. I've always thought that the backstreet abortionist, of which we've just seen an example, was the overwhelming argument for the change in the law. And I agree with Robert. I think it has been, to some extent, abused since. And I did vote for a reduction in the maximum period when it came before Parliament. But I have no doubt that the David Steele Act was a great reform.
Now, of all the issues that we're covering tonight, this is the issue that's still alive. I mean, the abortion issue is only recently been before Parliament. So was it opening the doors to abuse and dangerous behaviour?
Well, permit a little scepticism here. First of all, abortion in this country was legal before 1967, under the Alec Bourne case of 1938. And the problem with that was that it was largely available to people who were able to pay. And had the Alec Bourne provisions been more readily available to people who couldn't pay, then I think that would have been more acceptable than what we have now, which is abortion as a backstop to contraception, which actually increases the amount of abortion, so that each year the number of abortions rise. However, I don't believe, Margaret, that there is now anybody in this country over the age of 9 who doesn't know how babies were made. I have distinct doubts as to whether there were that many back in 1967.
Can you just explain the Alec Bourne
quite
case?
Extraordinary after all this sex education and distribution of condoms and schoolgirls being shown how to pull them over hockey sticks, how they still seem to manage to get pregnant in such large numbers. The availability of abortion statistically appears to increase the amount of abortion that takes place.
Can you give us details of the early case?
The Alec Bourne case was a doctor who, in 1938, was called to I think a 14-year-old girl who'd been gang raped by soldiers just off Whitehall. And he then performed an abortion, and he then reported himself to the police, and was tried and acquitted on the basis that what he'd done was acceptable in law, because the danger to the girl's health was so enormous. And ever afterwards, any doctor who wanted to perform an abortion on those grounds could do so. There is another. If you look at the
Peter, that's a travesty. That's a forgive me. I was a doctor working as a young obstetrician in a hospital with 4 very lenient and liberal consultants, all of whom would not invoke the Alec-Bourne legislation, because actually it was far too risky. And there was no question that in consequence women were certainly, as a result, going for illegal abortions and actually leaving pregnancy reporting till later and later. I remember being in casualty, being called down to casualty, being asked by the casualty officer to come down with this woman in abdominal pain, a 16-year-old in abdominal pain. She was in obstructed labour. She'd not told her parents that she was pregnant. That was actually practically happening on a regular basis.
What is interesting, again, is the secrecy that shrouded all these events in the private lives of the citizens of this country.
You were afraid to tell your mother, you were afraid to tell your doctor, you just felt terrible and you were frightened.
But again, is it really so good that as an alternative to that, we now massacre something in the region of 190,000.
You use such coloured
I do
languages.
use the word because that is what it appears to me to be.
Your language is outrageous, and you should be ashamed of that, because actually women do not go through abortion, just as they don't go through divorce. You seem to think people toss off divorce. They don't. They certainly do not toss off abortion either. Abortion is a very difficult decision for every woman, indeed for every couple.
Margaret.
Now, I would just like to say that on the 22, 24-week things, I have been very concerned about evidence about fetal sentience and the fact that the baby does feel pain in the womb. And Robert, I know you will disagree with me on this, but I think there is evidence that the pre-born baby, it doesn't just become conscious at the instant of birth. This complicates the issue enormously.
Well, Maggie, actually the evidence, which is mostly done from research in my unit, by Professor Vivek Glover, I mean, it really does not demonstrate pain. It demonstrates a change in hormonal status, but not pain.
I want to let me raise something else, which is that the campaign, the recent campaign and ongoing campaign to reduce the age of abortion, which will persist, I believe, even if it moves from 2022 20, gives evidence of the revival of religion as a moral guidance in our society. Now, that's an interesting change from the 60s, when, in a sense, we didn't call upon religious imperatives, did we? Did you feel that, Michael?
I didn't, to be honest. I think that most of the people who voted for a reduction in the period of time were not really influenced, some were, but most were not really influenced by religious considerations. As far as I'm concerned, I find it very difficult to accept a situation in which if a baby of 22 weeks was born and then killed, that would be murder. But if you kill a baby of 22 weeks when it's still within its mother's womb, that's perfectly legal and permissible. And I find that an impossible juxtaposition to accept. But it's not basically to do with any religious consideration.
This issue is not over, and it's not going to go away. It's the one issue that, in a sense, is the liveliest ever since. We've had changes in the law, of hanging, of course, in the 60s, changes to censorship. Also, rather importantly, the race relations industry got going, and there were laws changing against discrimination. Now, do we remember discrimination? Were you conscious of shops that said no blacks, no Irish?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, you knew that?
Oh, yes, of course.
And there was discrimination in medical schools, for example, where in fact... and in hospitals, where in fact one might be rather reluctant to actually employ an Asian graduate, for example, in a medical job. I mean, that was, I think one has to say, that was racial discrimination.
It was official too. While under arrest in several London police stations in 1969, I clearly remember seeing signs telling the police how to deal differently with what were described as men of colour. These were official printed notices. I wish I could remember exactly what they said, but they were there. And this is completely embodied in everything. There was an official as well as an unofficial racial discrimination in the country.
And has there been a law...
The extraordinary thing is there are now notices of the same kind following them, saying that men of colour should be treated differently, but for different reasons. The ideal which we thought we'd embraced in the 1960s of trying to stamp out racial discrimination of all kinds has been swapped for something entirely different.
What was interesting in tonight's programme earlier tonight was that they spoke of the intention being to create an integrated society. Integrated society was the ideal. And somewhere later than the 60s came along multiculturalism, and we are now only currently getting back to integration. That's an interesting path, isn't it?
The trouble with multiculturalism is that it means so many different things to different people. That's why I used to use it, and I try not to use it now, but because it's a confusing term. And the whole point of language is to be helpful in terms of conducting conversations. Integration, I think, is something which people do understand, and it's not a confusing term. And to my mind, it means that you should play your full part in the society in which you live. You can certainly be loyal to your own different traditions as well, but you should not separate yourself off, and you should play a full part in that society. And that should indeed be the goal.
Have there been laws of unintended consequences in terms of race relations? Has it presented problems within current society? I'm thinking about immigrants and people's anxiety about that. It still figures very much on people's agendas. Do you think, Peter?
I think it's once again the alteration of the original purpose in the 60s, which was the absolutely laudable one of, as Michael has said, of integration, of getting rid of racial discrimination, and the transformation of this into multiculturalism, which was the use of the word racist, which is often used against people who don't have a discriminatory bone in their body. The use of the word racist to stamp out those who were in favour of maintaining the monoculture of the existing country. And a cultural war has been launched in the name of anti-racism, which actually has very little to do with race and a lot to do with culture.
And not what people meant in the 60s.
And it's become, again, something which was a campaign for tolerance has become a campaign for intolerance, and that's what worries me.
I'm going to say something deeply politically incorrect now, but I think actually one example of what you're asking is probably seen in the more recent attempt to appoint young doctors to medical positions in hospital, whereby we fall over backwards not to discriminate against people from Asia and other countries, and we end up discriminating effectively against better British candidates who've been trained in some of the best medical schools in the world at huge expense to the taxpayer. That, I think, is a real issue, and it's meant that, of course, in the last year or two we've seen literally hundreds, if not thousands, of doctors out of work who've been trained really excellently in this country. That, I think, is quite a serious issue, and it's one that Parliament's still trying to address.
And I'm afraid it's not limited to the medical profession.
No, exactly, but yeah.
Let's look then at the picture overall and compare it to today. The evening on this channel was called Permissive Night. Was it a permissive stroke bad decade, or was it a tolerant stroke good decade? Maggie?
I think it was tolerant, stroke, good and permissive, in that it was permitting and it was enlarging the range of what we considered to be human. I mean, we didn't have judicial execution. Certain things that had been going on forever were legal rather than illegal. I think it was an increasing tolerance, and which was increasingly humanising for categories of people who had been outside the fold. And to me, that's tolerance and good.
Peter?
I think it was the decade of unintended consequences. I think many of the things which began then have not yet worked themselves out, but there have definitely been disadvantages, and I think it would be wrong to pretend that there haven't been, even for those who look back on it now with pure pleasure. And just as for someone like me, it's important to say that there were also good things that came out of it. But I think that there were many, many unintended consequences, and we live with them still.
And which legislation do you regret, or is it simply a drift of the tenor of society?
I mean, the one we haven't discussed is the one I regret most, which is the abolition of the death penalty, because I think that destroyed authority in the penal system, but and unleashed an enormous amount of violence in our society, which we still haven't seen anything like the end of. But the others, it's not so much the acts themselves that I find objectionable. I think the Divorce Act is still underestimated in its effect. It's what followed on from them, the transformation of the campaign for tolerance into politically correct intolerance.
Michael, you didn't want to bring back hanging, did you?
No, I did oppose abolition at the time, but I changed my mind subsequently, because I originally thought you could devise a system which really effectively eliminated the risk of a miscarriage of justice. And then some cases occurred which convinced me that that was not so, and that you would continue to have a significant risk of a miscarriage of justice, and I didn't feel I could live with a situation in which you hanged someone who was ultimately subsequently found to be innocent. I sort of agree with both Margaret and Peter. I think that the consequences of the decade have been beneficial in terms of tolerance. and a civilized society. There have been some unintended consequences which have been harmful, but I don't think you can attribute them to the legislative changes. I think you can perhaps attribute them to the decade as a whole, but not really to the legislative changes which we've discussed this evening.
Robert?
I think it was a tolerant era. I think it's one that we could be proud of, because I think we live in a very tolerant society. And I think that era is almost best summed up by Bernard Levin in The Pendulum Years, because he was able to poke fun at the attitudes. And in a sense, as long as we can do that, we demonstrate essentially tolerance rather than permissiveness.
Finally, what about television? Television had, and we're here discussing it, as we did throughout the 60s. Has television augmented all these changes? Has it emphasised them, helped them along, or prompted the booth?
Hugely important.
Hugely important,
Of
yes.
course, I mean,
Well,
it's a massively powerful medium.
And once violence on television is a wholly different subject, which we certainly can't do justice to in however few minutes remain. But that, I think, has had quite lasting and far-reaching consequences.
Margaret?
Yes, what we haven't mentioned at all is the internet, which has taken over from television as a mass media influence. Television now seems quite harmless and harmonious compared with some of the things that go on the internet.
I think television is now so much less intelligent than it used to be when it was in black and white. And all right, I'll accept 625 lines was an advance over 405, but what we have now seems to me to be mostly a moronic inferno. But the other thing that I regret about television, intelligent as it was in the 1960s, is that all the intelligence was on one side. It never gave a fair crack to the social and moral conservatives, who were always considered as uncivilized backwoodsmen, and were never, in my view, and never have since, been given a fair crack by television.
I do think there's a serious issue for people like the BBC to consider about the use of serious factual television on modern television. That seemed to be much more prominent before, and I think less so now. Thank God we've got really good radio in this country, because I think that actually is very much a saving grace. But I think Margaret's absolutely right. I think, in fact, the whole issue of the media changes with the advent of the internet. And that's going to revolutionise society in a way that we can't even begin to contemplate at the moment. It's a very liberating force.
I have to admit that Peter's strictures about the liberal consensus defined absolutely late-night line-up's role in the 60s. I think tonight we have demonstrated what you aspire to in television, which was intelligent conversation. Thank you all very much. Margaret Drabble, Michael Howard, Robert Winston and Peter Hitchens. And that's all from us tonight. Good night.